back to Tightlining Maryland. I appreciate you checking back in. Today we're going to do a video that has us talking about the European leader system that I use, and it's just a little bit of a difference between what I used to use with the mono rig and now what I use a little bit more primarily with the European style nymphing rig. So hopefully the goal for this video is just to explain the setup and structure that I have for the leader system I use, so that hopefully you could construct one of your own that could be similar, although it doesn't have to be identical, but something similar that ultimately will allow you to fish in a style that, you know, I think is one of the most effective ways to fish. And, you know, after starting conventionally fly fishing when I first kind of got into the sport, as I transitioned from the mono rig and now onto the European nymphing setup, I just feel like there are some things about it that I wanted to share with you that I think will be helpful if you ever hit the stream, but also hopefully maybe add a few more fish to the basket the next time you head out. There's somebody that I need to thank, and that is Josh Miller. He is somebody that is a guide for the Trout guide service. He's also somebody that mentors the youth fly fishing team for Team USA. Incredible guy, great angler, just an overall good steward for the sport. But Josh and I had a long conversation about the European, nymphing setup and just some of the things that one should be doing. And just in a phone call alone, I was able to take some of that information and put it out into the stream and practice it over the course of about the last dozen trips or so. And I've already found success here in this winter that otherwise I think I might have been able to pick up fish, but not maybe as many. So I want to thank him for all of his help, but also hopefully help kind of provide you some of that information that maybe it'll help you the next time, again, you fish. Just so you know, I've got links for all of this down below in this video. I would greatly appreciate if you consider, if you're going to be buying something, possibly getting it through those Amazon links. It helps support the channel. It helps me keep buying things like drones, or potentially a camera. I certainly don't make enough to afford all that, but it does help to chip away just ever so slightly. But I would also say, if you have a fly shop close, go support them. We need to support business, small business that is, in this pandemic, and those shops need your help all they can get. But if you don't have one close, or if you're just unable to kind of get out to one for whatever reason, by all means use those Amazon links below and pick up those items and make a leader for yourself and go out and catch some more fish. I think before we even begin, we need to talk about some of the prerequisites, because as great as a leader is, it's only going to be good as the rod that you put it on and the reel you pair it with. So let's talk about the overall setup. For me personally, whenever I'm fishing, I usually use my Syndicate P2 pipeline 3-weight, and it is 10 feet. That rod is made by Syndicate. And that particular rod is a great setup for European nymphing. Are there other rods out there that you could use? Absolutely. There is Thomas & Thomas rods if you want to get up to the tippy top. You could get, an Orvis Helios. You could do a Sage ESN. There's all kinds of rods that are going to break your bank. I personally can't afford them. So if you're looking for something that's kind of in that mid-tier price range, I would argue that a Syndicate P2 pipeline is as good as you're going to find. But then again, there's a Cortland that they do a Nymph series rod and an MK2. Even Orvis Recon has one that's tailored to this. I think that's kind of in your midpoint price range. I even helped somebody to kind of select a rod, and I didn't mention it yet, but that's the Orvis Clearwater. They also produce a nymphing rod and a 10-foot 3 or 4 weight that you could use. My buddy Nick is actually somebody that uses that, and when he first got into European nymphing and kind of fishing the mono rig, and now even utilizing something similar to a European nymphing setup, that rod has worked out really well for him. So my advice would be, before you jump in and spend all of your money on one rod, maybe just focus on getting a mid-tier rod that's going to be primarily a couple different things. 10 foot or larger. I think 10 feet is great. 10.5 foot is usually the sweet spot for a lot of people, and even 11 foot certainly works. If you're thinking about what size rod to get, I would tell you that anywhere from a 2 to a 4 weight rod is going to be all you need. I think the 4 is probably if you're going to be into bigger fish, and you might even utilize a little bit of the mono rig occasionally, and possibly have the need to turn over dries or streamers. But a 2 or a 3 weight is if you're going to be using pretty much nymphs only to some degree. You could certainly use micro streamers and some other things, but I'm just cautioning you that, again, 2 to 4 weight rods in 10 feet and up are really kind of what somebody's going to want in order for them to be able to utilize this system effectively. I think at an 8.5 or 9 foot rod, you're losing a little bit that you're otherwise not going to get with that 10-foot rod. So let's talk about why somebody would want a European nymph. I think one of the first reasons why it's critical that somebody is going to be effective in utilizing this style is because, quite frankly, a trout's diet, 90% of it approximately, is going to be subsurface. What that means is they are primarily feeding on nymphs, they're feeding on all different types of bugs, but just in general, their diet is predominantly made up of things that are subsurface. That's why nymphing is usually one of the most effective ways to catch trout, but also even occasionally a micro streamer might work on this very rig. Another reason why I think somebody would really enjoy this style of nymphing is that it takes away that bobber element, and there's 2 reasons why that can be a good thing. Number one, that splashes on the water as soon as it hits, so that creates a disturbance and likely means that you're going to alert fish and spook them. The other thing is that also potentially leads to drag, because if you don't have that perfectly sitting in the current, always mending, I think that you're going to lose contact with your nymphs, you're going to miss strikes, and you're just not even going to be able to catch as many fish. Another reason why I really love this setup is it is durable. You could use this leader, weeks on end, probably even months. I would argue that I've gotten away with using the same leader system for at least a month, if not even up to 3 to 6. Now at that point, you are going to start to see it breaking down, especially if you're fishing weekly or multiple times a week. But my point is, this is a very, very durable setup. Therefore, it's not like dry fly fishing where you're having to buy another leader every single time, and those leaders can cost you $3 for one, $9 for a pack of 3. This setup is going to be durable, but also cost effective. Speaking of that very point with the cost effective, that's something where, to me, I'm going to save money every time I go out, because realistically, I just need that leader and I'm going to add tippet. One tip or piece of advice that I would provide you for whenever you basically create your leader is that the tippet I use is typically on a larger spool. So for example, you could buy Seagar in a 100 or 200 yard spool of what would be 6 or 7X. I think some people will fish this system between 5 and 7X predominantly. However, I've seen also guys, nymph as kind of low as 3X. But my point is if you were buying a 100 yard or 200 yard spool of Seagar line, or let's say Berkeley Vanish, just making sure that, again, you get fluorocarbon. That's the most important thing. But if you have that tippet, and I carry around little spools of 30 yards, and I've had those for a while, but these days, quite frankly, I just put one large spool of 5X or 6X in my chest pack, and I keep that on me, the entire thing. And that really means for me that it's gonna save money and it's gonna be cost effective when you fish this way. With the material that we're gonna talk about today, and I'll show you real quick, one of the things that's in there, and we'll discuss it a little bit more later, is this cider material, which I'll quickly show to you right here on camera. You can see that that's got 2 different colors that really pop there on the screen. You've got that yellow, and then it goes into red. And if you were to keep peeling it off, it's gonna then go back into red. And that's how ultimately you're able to pick up strikes. You just wait for that line as you're giving it a drift and it's going through to, instead of that sag, it kind of pulls tight, or if it's moving and then it kind of pauses, that's something that you can kind of pick up on the strikes. I'll do a whole nother video on strike detection in a series that I'm going to work on throughout this year. I've got a chunk of different ways that I want to try to educate people on, how can you go out and implement this system and catch more fish. But the goal of this video is just to talk about the leader setup, and I'll come back to the use of cider and strike detection in another video. The very final thing for why I really like this system is that it doesn't have as much drag. The only real problem you can get into is when you fish 2 nymphs, and that if you have a long tag and you've made kind of a wonky cast, you might get one of those nymphs that kind of skirts out and gets in a different lane of current, and then they're going to be competing against one another, ultimately meaning that you're going to have some drag. But once you eliminate that bobber or thingamabob or any style of indicator, I think that realistically you're going to get a much much more drag-free or perfect drift. So now that we've talked about, kind of the reasons of why you should be European nymphing, let's get into the nuts and bolts about the setup of the leader itself. What's great about this system is that it really only takes this many materials. I'm holding all of them. My mono rig, it can take upwards of, I want to say 6 to 8 different components, but this leader system is super simple. Let's start with our first piece of material, and this is going to be Maxima Chameleon 10-pound test. You could certainly use a higher, pound system. I wouldn't go much higher. I think 10 to 12 is probably the spot you want to be in because you want it to be somewhat supple but yet delicate. And once you get up to 15 and 20, which is part of the mono rig, I think this 10 to 12 is exactly where you want to be because of its strength, but also its ability to kind of still be able to pick up strikes and still be able to cast it a good distance. The next piece of material is going to be some cider material, and for this you're going to want somewhere around 3 or 4x. I would argue that if you were going to pick only one thing, I would have 10-pound Maxima Chameleon, and I would also have 4x. In my hands I've got 3x, but behind me on the table I've also got 4. With that said, I showed you earlier kind of the look of the actual cider. There are other color options out there, one in which I tried that I've actually kind of liked in certain situations more than just this bicolor and kind of that pink or fuchsia as well as yellow. I've also tried the black and white, and I think Rio is the producer of that particular one too. If you were to get 3 or 4x, you should be good to go, and we'll talk very soon about the dimensions of how much you need of each. The last thing you're going to need is tippet rings. You can get these in a variety of places on different types of things. This one actually was just from Lively Legs, and they came in a loose kind of like little package, almost like you might get certain types of hooks or anything like that. But nevertheless, I use 3mm. You could certainly have one a little larger, a little smaller, but I think this is kind of right in that middle area that's just large enough for what you're trying to accomplish here. I use these to connect the Maxima Chameleon to the cider, and then my cider to the tippet. So right here is a breakdown of the different amounts that I use, and I'll walk you through what each of them are. I don't think I ended up using it for the cover image, but I did have an image in there, and I'll probably display this for you at the very end so that you can see it in case you just wanted a quick snapshot. But let me walk you through the different things about this rig and explain how to make it. The nice thing about this is your fly line is irrelevant. No matter whether or not you've got European nymphing line like I have on my rod, or if you have a weight forward floating line, it's really not going to be that big of a difference. Now I wouldn't have sink tip line on there just to clarify, but really the goal of your fly line is just to help balance the rod and reel together paired with this leader system. So at the end of the day, don't focus too much on your line, because all you're going to need it to do is connect to the Maxima Chameleon. How are you going to connect it? I would tell you to find some videos on YouTube that are about nail knots. I personally looked one up, found one that was pretty simple. I just used my bodkin to be able to connect the two pieces together, tied my nail knot around it, and did it pretty seamlessly. That was actually an easier knot than I anticipated, but I'm going to connect my Maxima Chameleon to my fly line. Now, in terms of how much Maxima Chameleon do you want? You want somewhere in the range of about 20 to 24 feet. The reason why you want this is because you want it to be able to get throughout your entire rod, and keep in mind again, you're using a 10-foot rod, so you're going to want that first 10 feet just from your reel through your rod tip. And then the other 10 feet is going to be, 10 to 14 feet that is, are going to be out your guide, so that way you can kind of cast and focus on distance. Because as you fish this, and again I'll do a video on demonstrating this, but the point is you're going to be casting upwards of 10 to 20 feet out in front of you. So whenever you see me in a video like I've been doing recently talking about catching fish from distance, that might mean that I was 15, 20 feet, possibly even 25 feet away. For me, that is substantially further than what I'm used to on the mono rig. So once you have this 20 to 24 feet, that really is the bulk of this particular system. Now keep in mind, certain states might have different regulations on how long a leader can be. If I'm not mistaken, Pennsylvania kind of limited theirs to 20 or 22 feet. I don't believe that this style leader applies to that. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. But I'm almost certain, especially given that the competition anglers and the people that are in the circuit up in PA fish this way, I'm almost certain that this is a legal format. But again, check your local regulations, make sure it is going to be up to code, and that way you don't run into any trouble. The next piece of material you're going to need is going to be your cider off of the end of that 20 to 24 feet of Maxima Chameleon. At that point, you're going to put on 4 feet of your cider. With that cider material, you're gonna want about 4 feet coming off of that tippet ring. That is good enough because you're gonna have enough segments of that red to yellow to red to yellow where you should be able to pick up on one. The only real time I have trouble picking up on my cider is usually right after low light, so after it's dawn, going into high sun. Occasionally with my back to the sun or vice versa, facing it, I can have a little bit of difficulty picking it up. But again, there are other color options out there and you can figure out what works best for you. Now, with that 4 feet of cider at the end of it, you're gonna have another tippet ring. So realistically, it's 20 to 24 feet of Maxima Chameleon. Then you've got a little tippet ring. Off of that, you're gonna have 4 feet of your cider, and then you're gonna have another tippet ring. That makes up your leader. The only other element that we talked about earlier is tippet. And with that said, you're now going to be using whatever tippet size you think is most effective. And again, I think for this particular setup, somewhere in that 5 to 7 range is probably the sweet spot. You could certainly go a little lower, and I respect that. But at the end of the day, you want to be getting it down. You want to be able to cut through that water as quick as possible. And the higher X tippet you use, meaning 6 and 7X, is going to sink the fastest. So that would be my recommendation. I prefer to use about 6 feet of tippet. When I was talking to Josh, this was a key point that he had brought up to me. He said, there are so many variables in fishing, and the goal is just to make it as simple as possible. So if I go out there with the same amount of tippet every single time, what I can do is modify how high my rod is, or how far back am I trying to guide it. There's a lot of ways that you can compensate to get that down, as well as even the beads that you use on your nymphs. But my point is, with 6 feet of tippet, that keeps things always the same, and it makes it easier to make the adjustments instead of always having to cut up your tippet and make adjustments. My old way of fishing when I first started with the mono rig is I wanted to use 1.5x the depth. So if the water was 2 feet, I wanted 3.5 feet. If the water was 4 feet, I wanted 6 feet. So my point is, if you were to kind of simplify this and just say, hey, I'm going to use about 6 feet of tippet, that's kind of like a way for you to just learn exactly what that 6 feet is going to do at all times. And then you can vary again. The nymphs that you use, the beads that are on them, the way that you guide it through, how high your rod is, all those elements kind of help you out. But in total, if you then start thinking about how long is this leader, 24 feet into 4 feet, into 6 feet. So now you're talking that's 34 feet. That gives you a lot of room to really take all of that, Maxima Chameleon and really shoot it out there and get a long cast and be able to fish a greater distance away from the fish. That gives you an advantage because they're less likely to be aware of your presence, but also be able to still detect those strikes. That cider is critical to help you out with that, and that's going to be what's closest to the water at all times. So just to wrap up, I hope that you were able to get something from this video, taking away maybe a new way to fish. I think it is a very, very productive way to put yourself on fish. Is it going to be the best way to fish? Maybe, maybe not. That's up to your individual opinion. There are some people that like to swing west. There's some people that like to chuck streamers. There's some people that like to, nymph with an indicator. That's fair. We all have, kind of our own niche. But at the end of the day, I have found that using a mono rig, but now more so using this European nymphing setup, that I'm finding a lot of success. And with that said, this particular setup that I guided you through today, I hope you're able to create one of your own. I look forward to breaking down the difference in the mono rig and European leader in a future video, but for now, tight lines and thank you for watching.